I think that design historically and dominant design practices are actually eroding creativity. They're eroding the plurality of ways of shaping. It's saying, here, take the IDEO toolkit, take this way of doing design, these methods, and implement them in these ways. And actually, I think design needs, for its own survival, for its own ongoing intentional adaptation of the systems, it needs to be nurturing the pluralities of shaping so that it is creating regenerative systems. The basis of creativity requires the contradictions between different ways of doing things. So design depends on plurality. And if it's not nurturing it, we have a problem.
Hello, and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Josina Vink as we take a communication perspective on nurturing collective reflexivity in design. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Josina Vink. Josina is a designer and researcher with expertise in health system transformation. They are currently Associate Professor of Service Design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design in Norway, and their research explores how design can create profound and significant change in health and care by reshaping social structures. You can read more about Josina in the show notes, and you'll obviously get to hear from them yourself in just a moment. I don't feel the need to provide a ton of context for this conversation today. If you listen to my last episode with Adona, then you'll already have some context because Josina is another person that I met at the RSD conference in Oslo in October, hosted by the Systemic Design Association. There's a lot to think about in this conversation, and I think I will let it speak for itself. So let's just jump right into the conversation with Josina. Hi, Josina. Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Abbie.
I'm really excited to be in conversation with you today. And like I'm starting every podcast this season, I want to start us off by laying down some context for each of us personally and ask, how are you arriving today?
Yeah, I am coming in from a busy start of a semester here in Oslo of teaching. So I'm coming in with lots of inputs from my students and my PhD students and feeling like a learner of my students. So have lots of their like voices in my head and challenges, and yeah, feel like I'm evolving as I'm learning with them. So coming in a bit of a pause amid a storm and a whirlwind.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm excited to hear about that. How I'm arriving is, a spark for this conversation was interacting with you at the Relating Systems Thinking and Design conference that we were both at in October. And that conference was just such a meaningful experience to me and has really helped me reflect on what I want to create in this podcast. So that's something that I'm bringing with me today in terms of like, I've already recorded a couple of podcasts for this year, and I'm really, really happy with what I'm creating. And I think it's, at least to me, kind of, there's something noticeably different than pre that conference to now. Yeah. And I know I've shared with you that language of like collective learning. It's very easy for me as the host to kind of default to like, I'll just ask the questions, or like a lot of the people I have like, a certain expertise or experience that I don't have. And so it's easy to kind of like defer to be like, well, you tell me all your stories and I want to learn from you. But also less for me and more for like seeing myself as like the CMM representative in this space. I'm trying to lean more into that collective learning in terms of like, what do I have to offer? What can CMM bring to the conversation too? And what can we all learn? So those are things that are top of my mind today as we go into this conversation.
Beautiful. I'm along for that collective learning ride. That's
wonderful. Great. Okay. Well, Josina, please introduce yourself to us. What's the story you're telling about yourself? Who are you? What do you want us to know about you as we go into this conversation?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start just to say that I use they, them pronouns. I am a scholar, a practitioner, a human. To kind of like locate myself a little bit in history, I grew up as a kid in rural Ontario, Canada, and really was somebody who felt a lot of like itchiness on my skin about the world around me, growing up in kind of
Mm,
a Dutch Catholic family and what I would deem to be a pretty kind of conservative rural space and place. And I think I was constantly imagining the world otherwise and wanted to like diverge from whatever I was being told and would find little bits and ways to do that. I had no idea about the world of design and had no access to it for a good chunk of my life. So I went to school for business because I thought what I was exposed to is that entrepreneurs,
mm,
they make the world otherwise.
mm-hmm.
That was the closest contact I had. And so I was really interested in shaping health systems. So I thought, oh, I'll bring like a business perspective into health systems. But actually, most of my business program, I similarly felt this irritation of like, wow, we're talking about numbers. I'm really interested in people and
Yes.
relations. So I really felt this kind of like, irritation. And then eventually kind of came into design as a way of shaping things in other directions, particularly health services and health systems. And that's how I kind of arrived there in the North American context. I started practicing it for a few years. And while I found it to be like a sense of home in the practice, I was really irritated by all of the way in which design was being promoted. And I wasn't seeing
Mm-hmm.
that kind of impact reflected in the kind of changing of systems that I was really eager to create these kind of radical transformative shifts. So at that time, then I kind of shifted to the Scandinavian context to do my PhD, learn from participatory design in Sweden. And now I'm in Norway, where, yeah, I guess my intention is to kind of keep pushing the boundaries of design practice and a design in my own life and kind of shaping of worlds within those spaces.
That's a great introduction and gets me excited and takes me back to entering into the Relating Systems Thinking and Design conference that I felt nervous entering into that space because kind of the first people I introduced myself to was like, oh, I'm a this kind of designer. I'm a this kind of designer. And then they look at me of like, introduce yourself. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm a designer. Like, am I
Yeah.
allowed to call myself a designer?
Mm.
So I'm curious to know from you, what is design and
Yes.
who is it for?
Thank you. Thanks also for that like personal context.
Yeah.
While I am a kind of associate professor of service design, I'm using like kind of quotes in that and trying to be a little bit mocking it. I really take this orientation that design is an everyday practice. So
Hmm. Hmm.
I did my master's in design and I learned that kind of expert designers are often crafting these end outputs. Actually, my explorations have led me to understand design as a practice of intentionally shaping kind of the social worlds that we're in.
Yeah.
So for me, intentionality is at the core. That's not necessarily to say like predictability or control. It's just
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
intentionality in how we are relating to the context around us. That to me is design. And of course, professional designers that are trained in various disciplines have specific, often aesthetic kind of skills and sensibilities that can help in shaping those for themselves and for others. But in my kind of view of design, it's something that we're doing in our everyday lives whenever we're intentionally
Yeah.
navigating the kind of social world that we're swimming in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So then you're like you said, a kind of specific area for you is service design. What is that?
Yeah. So I also kind of resist a more typical idea of services that would say
Hmm.
like these are intangible kind of market offerings like banking is a service. We don't
Hmm. Hmm.
necessarily see these kind of products coming from banking, these tangible things. But I would say that service much more broadly is this exchange of knowledge and skills for the benefit of someone else. So if we kind of break that down, you might think of a baker that is giving bread and a farmer that is growing wheat. And normally you'd think, okay, they are like delivering products. But actually, to me, when I see this kind of more holistic idea of service, it's they are exchanging knowledge and skills for each other's
Yeah.
benefit. And so all around us in our family dynamics, in our communities, we are exchanging knowledge and skills for each other's benefit. And to me, that is the premise of the idea of service. It's that we are interdependent and we need each other's knowledge and skills to survive and to thrive. And so service is the kind of exchange of that.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful perspective to frame it that way to me, because, I don't know if you use this language, but you're, doing it, what CMM, the theory that I work with, is rooted in, is, called social construction. And that is so important, I think, to name as being the kind of foundation of coordinated management of meaning, and like my whole perspective, because I don't think you can take for granted that people know that they get to create their social worlds, they get to design their social worlds, because I think there's a lot of systems that have previously been designed that make us feel like we're powerless. And so that's why it's so important to me, as like step one is like the buy-in of the language that CMM would use, is you are an active participant. You are a meaning maker. Meaning is socially constructed. And so just like kind of bringing that choice back to you. And I love the distinction you made, that this isn't to say that you have perfect control over everything, but you get to be intentional and mindful in the choices you make in terms of how you show up, and then go from there, starting with that intentionality.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's lovely. I'm interested to dialogue with you about this, because I think I fully agree. This kind of acknowledging that you're part of shaping and the meaning making. For me, the reason maybe that I like diverge from meaning being central is that I think that I've looked at some of your previous podcasts and things like that, episodes, that you're exploring a very embodied perspective of meaning and communication as well. So for me, often communication and meaning tend to be siloed into more oral or written kinds of things. And this idea of kind of shaping, including the material realms of our world and the intersections they have with the kind of social meaning and things like that, that's really important, especially to me. So I think I use design in kind of trying to keep that broad, but I think you have a very broad idea of kind of meaning when you're talking about social construction and shaping. So I think we're quite aligned in that respect, in terms of seeing that important first step of acknowledging our own role and our own agency. But for me, the thing with that is that we're also really embedded. So it's nice to say we have agency. It's nice to say that we are participating. But yeah, it's so easy to get stuck, because there are power dynamics and we are infiltrated constantly by social structures. So for me, that those kinds of norms and rules and roles are constantly invading our thinking and my own. So I think, yeah, it's a messy middle that we're navigating when we're embedded in all of these things.
Absolutely, the messy middle. I'm going to hit you with some big CMM language here, and you'll get it, but this is kind of what my work is about, like translating. So the heart of CMM, the main claim of the theory, is persons in conversation, which is all of us, co-create our own social realities and are simultaneously shaped by the worlds we create. So that, both of those, you have to say both of those together. Yes. And so what I'm curious to know about design is that this is a verb. This is me designing, than me doing something, but also how are you paying attention to how what we design shapes us in terms of the stories we tell, or the meaning we're able to make, or the new systems we're able to design based on where we're at.
Yeah, I think we met in this kind of relating systems thinking design. So we're both very interested in this kind of systemic perspective and the idea of systems, because for me, it's a lot about kind of how these things are entangled in each other and the relational nature, and that we can't just kind of narrowly design one thing, that it does have this feedback loop and counter effect, as you're getting at. So I think that's really important. But actually, I also want to like push against this like big system design idea that thinking systemically means that we're shaping huge systems or in systems in their totality. And so I think even right now, you and I, this is the second time that we've kind of interacted in a kind of synchronous way. And I would say, like, how you are showing up in this conversation and what you're bringing, your background and your literal, Zoom background that I'm seeing right now, and what I know about you, that's kind of shaping how I come forward. And what I put forward when I'm doing this work intentionally is kind of a response to that. And it shapes your response. So I think we're kind of constantly in this exchange. And I would go even further and say it's not just an exchange, it's that we're actually kind of constituting each other, that you are made up by me and I'm made up by you. And we're in this stew where we, what you're bringing is making me a little bit more of what you're bringing and vice versa. So in that way, I think when we're designing, we have to acknowledge that what we're making and shaping and putting out into the world is part of our stew.
Yeah.
It is absolutely influencing us. And of course, that also means we have to be very mindful about unintended consequences and those things. So yeah, I think it's a hugely important issue that you're raising.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you're saying. In a previous conversation I had with Sheila McNamee, who's a co-founder of the Taos Institute and, very much in the world of construction, she makes the distinction that, she used to say, her work was about social construction, but she's moving into this language of relational construction because what you're saying, it's in the space between us. Like meaning doesn't happen in me, it happens between us, like when you're storytelling, that's kind of the meaning making. And so that does really stick with me as like the relational component of it. You really can't remove it. And we both, in our areas use this language of embodied. So I'm curious to know what that means to you. And as I was thinking about wanting to ask you that question, I was thinking, well, what does it mean to me? And I think as you're talking, you were helping me clarify that what it means to be embodied is that it's not something you turn on and off, kind of like maybe you would say you're not, okay, now I'm designing, now I'm not designing. It's like in my showing up every moment, I am designing, quote unquote, I am communicating, I'm using a communication perspective, to use my perspective. You're kind of doing that in every moment. And that's what it means to be embodied for me, at least. So I'm curious what it means to you or how you think about it.
Yeah, I guess when I'm reflecting on the word embodiment, I think about the core being body, and I think about our human bodies. And for me, being in a human body gives us access to touch. It allows us to hear sound. So it is my access point to these things in between, to the relational realms, to you. And so I kind of think, if you like, thinking about the body as like a portal or a through zone, and a little less about the skin being the stop and start point of our bodies, and more that, it's the movement, the embodiment being kind of the movement between in this vessel. But I really see embodiment as a way of getting at the relational that you mentioned, as particularly thinking about, let's say, emotions and sensations. When we're in a kind of heated argument, my heart starts racing and I might even get a little like rosy on my cheeks. And these kind of bodily indicators tell me, oh, you're reacting. It could be that there's kind of something socially inappropriate that has happened, or something that I'm, politically against, or whatever that might be. But my body is actually making these quite like complex integrative learnings about all of these systems that I've been a part of before, and the one that I'm in if I'm in a heated argument with you. And so for me, the body gives me access to huge complexity of relations, because it's storing up all of those relations that I've ever known, So I really see it as this kind of like material portal or access point into the like relational realms of things.
Yeah, I appreciate you articulating that, because I was struck in your first, introduction of yourself talking about, something felt itchy or it felt irritating, and you kind of like gestured to your arms, like irritating on the skin almost. And I could so picture that, what it feels like when something is itching me or when my skin's irritated, and used it like that was such a great kind of like, and not metaphor maybe, but like, visualization, or like making it physical, this like mental experience, because like you're saying, they are connected. It's especially if you're trying to be embodied in your ways of being. That makes a lot of sense to me to hear, also because CMM to me is so much about process. And we talk about turns, which you kind of referenced, like we are responding to each other, and what I say is based on what you say. And so that's a really helpful way to kind of, zoom in on communication, of like, because of the question that is really important to me, especially if you are taking a constructionist communication perspective, is what are we making here? And so that's something that I bring to, these podcast conversations, and every conversation I try to be in is, okay, we are creating something here.
Mm.
And so the quality of our communication is what creates the quality of our social worlds. And so the language that CMM offers is that the goal, then, if that's true, the goal is better social world. So we get to define first what's a better social world. And that's something that just emerges along the way. We, to some extent, we can't know what's better until we're in the better. And so that's something that's kind of coming to me as we're talking right now. So I'm curious to hear a little more, though, about that language you've used of like this physical experience and embodiment in your own life. I just wonder, like, can you pinpoint a moment where you started connecting your physical experience to maybe your intellectual experience or emotional or relational experience? Or do you feel like you've maybe like always been connected in that way?
No, I think mostly I was in massive denial and feeling the
Yeah.
itchiness and
Yeah.
not knowing what to do with it. And I think for some ways there's this massive entanglement of my everyday life and my academic explorations, because I think in some ways I've been academically trying to intellectually learn how to access those things in also. So I'm doing all of this research. Particularly, I'm interested in when you're saying, like, what are we making? For me, I'm usually using the language of social structures as being the things that we shape. So the kind of enduring shared norms, rules, values, beliefs. And so I became kind of positively obsessed with these in my research, and exploring how they're shaped in health and care practices, and watching other people attempting to kind of move the needle on different rules and roles, and prototyping different kind of approaches to this. And then after doing my PhD and working as an associate professor, and I lived with a couple other roommates, and one of my roommates actually, their partner was visiting them, and their partner at the time used they, them pronouns. And I had not interacted much with people who did not use either she or her pronouns. And so I went into the kitchen and I was referring to this person, and I used their wrong pronouns. And I had this kind of like wave come over me that knew, like, this is not what I intended to do. This is like, this kind of like bodily rush. And so I kind of like apologized, switched, and moved on. And all of a sudden realized, I found this kind of, it was a bit of a disturbing experience of my own reaction to it, my own lack of understanding. And so that quite embodied physical reaction in my kitchen started me onto a course of like understanding and reflecting on my own gender and my own socialization into being first a girl and then a woman, and how much that didn't resonate, and how itchy that was when I, like, so often people said like, oh, let's have like a women's night. And I always felt so irritated by this. It was like, I cannot, or just any of these. And increasingly people were starting to ask, like, please state your preferred pronouns. And I just didn't want to state mine because they didn't feel very good. And it was this feeling, this kind of like bodily feeling. So, and then slowly I started to kind of prototype with some of my closest friends and my partner at the time, what it would be like to use they, them pronouns, because I felt much more gravitating to that, even though I felt like, oh, I couldn't possibly. So I just tried it in these like tiny little pockets, and it felt like I felt so seen, and I felt like $1,000,000, just like, oh my goodness, this is the me, like that I've always wanted access to, so much less itchy. And, this is just an experience of like these sensations giving us indicators, and then also trying it out, like in practice, knowing, how people are relating to me shapes me back. So gender being this very relational thing, and pronouns being very relational. So when people are saying them to me, that's actually reflects how I'm feeling in my own body, how I'm feeling about my own gender. So people saying my preferred pronouns really actually allowed me to be more of myself and feel more aligned in this kind of social world. So I think that's a kind of close example of the social structures around gender that I've really felt a lot of embodied relation to, and then have worked slowly kind of over time with these relations and people in my life, and a much larger societal transformation and dialogue and push and pull that's happening around gender right now. So certainly not alone in this kind of navigating such a transformation, but it took me being prompted by quite a physical experience to then reflect and interrogate, and then see that actually all of this research that I've been doing on social structures was part of a self-discovery process of getting me closer to my own ways of inhabiting the world that were not just a reflection of what I was, the social structures I was kind of socialized by, but other ways of being that kind of better reflected the way that my body felt good in.
I too feel that I early on, or by default, wasn't, the way that I say it is like, I don't feel like I learned to speak the language of my body. And so like a moment like you're talking about makes a lot of sense to me, of like reminding ourselves the physical sensations we have, that's not on accident. Like it is by design, in a, you know, in a way, in terms of what that's information for us.
Yeah.
There's a woman that I like who's an author and a podcaster, Glennon Doyle, and she talks about going towards like what feels warm. And I think she's a very kind of like touchy-feely person like that. But she talks about that in terms of like her business and like decision making, and being like, when she's trying to decide what direction to go in personally, I think, or professionally, she's talked about what she tries to do is get in touch with that sensing part of her and says, well, okay, let me think about this option. Does that feel cold? Does it feel warm? Does it feel good and cozy? Or does it feel sharp and pointy, you know, and like, I just appreciate all this different language to talk about, again, how we can show up in these moments in an embodied way that can really help us. Because I think, again, also by design, I think so many of us are disconnected from our body. So it makes sense to me too, that especially if you are in a world of like health systems, that maybe physicality would come to the forefront of that. Could you talk more about your experience with designing health systems?
Yeah, certainly. So I mean, a lot of the impetus for that was like in my, tiny rural life in the Canadian context, I had a parent with a significant mental health issue. And so I really saw firsthand this kind of like this system like of just like acute getting, forced into treatment in this acute circumstance, and then boomeranging out and not having any support, and like the ripple effects, and just feeling like this does not work. Like, so just again, feeling it kind of firsthand. So that was a big part of my impetus for feeling like, okay, something's got to give here. This health system that we have is not really thinking about kind of all the different realms. It's not enough to treat this episodic, acute instances. And so, yeah, I guess along my wandering path, after going through for business and things like that, I went down to the US, to West Virginia, where Patch Adams, I don't know if you ever saw that movie, Abbie. No. Okay. Maybe you're too young, a little younger than me. It was a movie with Robin Williams. But basically the movie was based on a true story of a doctor who was trying to create a fun hospital, something like the opposite of what we think about as these like very serious things. Yeah. So I went down to visit Patch Adams in this place where this kind of hospital was being built. And it was through that experience that I was introduced to the idea of design in relation to health systems, that we actually, can design our interactions as a doctor and patient. Maybe we're both doctors, maybe we're both patients, and that this is a design decision. So I was like, my mind was blown, I was like, okay. So maybe actually what I'm most interested in is the design of these health systems. So I went back to the Canadian context and started practicing. And I then did this master's in design and started trying out what design in these health systems looks like. But of course, our health systems, when we're designing from within, they're also, they have these giant silos. They are a very evidence-based culture, which is very important. We really want scientific evidence to drive these things. But as you're getting at, Abbie, like, where's the space for the embodied knowledge when in our own health, in how we're shaping our systems? And this has been something that I've been kind of both playing with and struggling with in healthcare transformation work. How do we actually support people to tap into their own embodied knowledge, their own kind of ways reactions to their present ways of relating, and understand the kind of systemic patterns that they're relating to, and be part then of larger transformation efforts to intentionally and collectively learn from each other and make adaptive changes over time. So I'm a little less interested in saying like, Abbie, I have the vision for the next healthcare system.
Yeah.
Actually, when I was 10, I really did. I was like drawing visions for a community-based, like, library, care library, blah, blah, blah. Great idea when I was 10. But now it's like, maybe as a design human in this space, it's less about only the vision that I have for these health systems. And I'm really interested in how do we create the conditions for many people to continue shaping them. And as we started at the beginning of the conversation, we're often so stuck, and people feel this way, especially in healthcare. The rules are made by someone else, and they are just playing a game. And this to me is this kind of hopelessness that we often carry in our healthcare systems is some of the most disturbing. So I am very interested in creating conditions for folks that are in these systems, including patients, including next of kin, including service providers, including administrators, to be part of these kinds of intentional relational adaptations over time. And so that our systems are not just one thing. I think we've been heavily influenced by bureaucratic systems, heavily influenced by certain models of professional, like doctors, medical knowledge. We've been very influenced, increasingly so, by the market. And maybe in the US, not so recent, but we've had some really dominant kind of ways of informing our healthcare design. And I think we really need to make space for other ways of shaping these community-based practices, including faith-based approaches that speak to different communities, and really exploring a plurality of ways that these can continue to evolve. So not just design setting kind of one destination for, okay, the Norwegian healthcare system should be like this in 2040, but actually ensuring that we have lots of folks who feel and have the conditions to have agency to continue shaping the worlds that they're in and learning from each other. So this collective learning bit and how design can feed into it, for me, is really, really important.
I hear that. And I hear you say that you're playing and struggling. And one of the frames that I like to use, because it's very CMM-ish, is to ask, and this is oversimplified, but what's the old story, or what's the dominant story or narrative? And then what's the new story that you are wanting to try to tell? So I'm curious if you could, using that frame, kind of articulate a little more about this playing and struggling that you're doing in terms of entering into this space of design, entering into the space of how health systems are designed, or social structures, whatever you'd like to touch on, in using the frame of what's kind of the dominant narrative in terms of this is how it is, and what's the new story you're hoping to tell through your work?
Yeah. I think the dominant story in Norway at present, where I'm working in kind of public health systems, is that there has been, and there should continue to be, a strong trust in government to make the appropriate decisions about what is needed for our healthcare systems. And folks inside those systems need to be trusted to follow those kinds of defined regulations, practices, and that they are some of the best in the world, and that they should kind of continue in that way. That to me would be a kind of dominant story that's told in the spaces that I'm working in. So I guess just to kind of contextualize, again, I grew up in the Canadian context. I didn't grow up in the Norwegian context. So I think that, vast generalization I'm about to make, but I think as a whole, folks in Canada create a belief in the workings of public systems, not necessarily just through trust, but through distrust, through ongoing kind of political conversation, and that this kind of skepticism put to work of engaging in these relational negotiations and discussions that is curious and sometimes skeptical. That is how we keep our public systems alive, by kind of pushing and moving the needle and making sure that others are. So it's in this much more ongoing negotiation that I think this is happening. So kind of with that in mind, I think that trust in and of itself is cultivated. Trust and distrust are not mutually exclusive. They are actually mutually dependent ideas. So I think trust is actually created through distrust, and distrust it requires trust in these things. So I'm interested in this kind of story that I want to tell. It's actually, I would say, like a story of many stories. That we need to be a part of adapting our healthcare systems to continue ensuring that they are working for the people that they are intended for. And if maybe even sometimes they're not reflective of the communities that they're serving. And so we actually need to shift who they're intended for and ensure that others who have previously been marginalized from shaping those systems are engaged in the process of shaping these healthcare systems. So actually, one of my next big projects is looking at how youth in Norway, particularly in relation to municipal health and care systems, how are youth that are marginalized, those that are outside of education or work or discriminated against for a particular aspect of their identity, how can we partner with those youth to actually redesign how mainstream services are being delivered? So instead of saying, oh, we should try and quickly design a program to get those youth back into employment, a training program, or to get them back into education, that's what we're doing a lot of. I'm much more interested in cultivating spaces where these folks that have typically been marginalized can be a part of the ongoing adaptation to ensure that these systems better serve them and others in similar situations. So less seeing them as users of a system or as folks who are, removed from a system and saying they too are system shapers, and actually they hold a lot of value and contributions to society in having, different perspectives and different needs, and can help us kind of make more robust, equitable systems that kind of offer dignity in those processes.
Yeah. Another old story, new story that I'm hearing in what you're saying is that, well, another context that I'm bringing is I just spoke with Adona Arneson, another participant at the RSD conference, and she talks about regeneration. And that's kind of what I'm hearing in what you're hoping to create. And that you're saying, it's what you're creating is not one thing where it's like, once we make the system this way, then it will forever function perfectly. You're saying what we need to make is a system that is adaptable and regenerative so that everyone can show up and create what they need as it inevitably changes, which is really important to acknowledge because to me, I think the distinction there is the difference when you're talking about the world of design, maybe the difference between what is designed and designing, as like a very active verb, that the focus is on the creating itself rather than acting like, okay, I'm coming in as a designer. I or someone else has the answer in terms of what this should look like that is a perfect system, quote unquote. And even if that's altruistic, I want to address everyone's needs. I want to make a system that functions well for the people that are in it, but also how can it be regenerative? And maybe that's a kind of new story that's more being added into the mix in terms of design. I don't know what your perspective on that is.
I think that's a lovely framing. And I would say for too long, design has been this kind of expert designer idea that is designing a perfect system based on these kind of altruistic ideas. And I think you're exactly hitting the nail on the head with one of the problems of that, or a key problem with that, is that that's not regenerative. That doesn't allow for the next change. So designers are just then these expert designers designing in that kind of dominant way are just designing the legacy system of the future that then is again hard to change and, holding people hostage and all of those things. So I think that design historically and dominant design practices are actually eroding creativity. They're eroding the plurality of ways of shaping. It's saying, here, take the IDEO toolkit, take this way of doing design, these methods, and implement them in these ways. And in doing so, saying all other forms of shaping, not so relevant. This is the right way to do it. And actually, I think design needs, for its own survival, for its own ongoing intentional adaptation of the systems, it needs to be nurturing the pluralities of shaping so that it is creating regenerative systems, because otherwise, the sustainability of our system is just, completely eroding both the systems it's in and itself. It's the basis of creativity requires the contradictions between different ways of doing things. So design depends on plurality. And if it's not nurturing it, we have a problem. So I think exactly that we need to be nurturing plurality so that we can continue to adapt, not just to what's happening today, but this kind of completely unpredictable and things that we don't know about what is to come.
Yeah. You're making me think that there's kind of two schools of thought in communication. And one is that there is a capital T truth that is out there and we need to find it. And then the other perspective, which is more the CMM perspective, is of pluralistic truths. There are many little t truths out there. Each of us maybe have our own little t truths. Each of us have maybe multiple little t truths inside of us that can feel contradictory. And so it's out there somewhere for me to find. It's more like in here, and I'm creating it, what my truth is, through this meaning-making process. And importantly with that, I'm learning how to lean into what can perhaps sometimes feel like a tension, maybe an itchiness, irritation, a pain of the coexistence of the little t truths, because it's a lot simpler if there's one truth that applies to all of us. It's a lot more uncomfortable if there's little t truths that feel contradictory. And so to me, it's about creating the space for all of those stories to coexist, and learning and practicing and gaining the tools to engage with that complexity. And for me, that's where dialogue comes in, because we can talk to each other and we're not even all great at just talking, but dialogue to me is kind of this like elevated presence. And the definition that we use is it's standing firm in your own little t truth, and what you know to be true, and your stories and your experiences. And at the same time, being profoundly open to other people's experiences. And so that's a real tension there, of learning to hold both of these things and lean into the kind of complexity and the nuance of that. And so I'm really interested to know about where dialogue enters into this conversation for you, maybe in terms of how dialogue helps us all to engage in design.
Great question. And as we talked a little bit about, I did this kind of like minor in dialogue at Simon Fraser University while I was doing my business school. So I'm very passionate about dialogue. And I think the practice of facilitation and being a listener is such a core to the practice of design. So I think I love what you're getting at around this kind of multiplicity of truths.
Yep.
And one of the things when I was in this kind of minor in dialogue and we were practicing dialogue every day, one of the things that I learned was this idea also. So you're saying like, be grounded in your truth and allow space for other people to be grounded in their truth. But I think exactly holding space for that coexistence and the interdependence across, I really saw firsthand that sometimes other people can speak your mind for you also, because we're engaged in similar practice, or even in opposition to what someone says, you can kind of like learn about yourself. So I think there's something about a beautiful thing about dialogue also in the in-betweenness that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Because I think while I'm like infatuated with plurality, it in and of itself, I don't think it's enough. We have to get better at the negotiations and the tensions and the contradictions that you're talking about, and including in design, to actually support the kind of learning. And of course, learning can often go in a direction of negative appropriation, and we have to be sure that we're allowing folks to shape worlds and their own ways of knowing and being on their own terms. But there is a need for kind of exchanging that and negotiating between each other. So I think holding space for this dialogue in systemic design, very, very critical. And I'm increasingly, as a facilitator, leaning into conflict, as you're talking about. Like, I really strayed from it. I was very conflict averse at the beginning. We're taught to kind of help people have a great time so that they like design in these kinds of workshops. But now I'm even, I'm stirring the pot in kind of like workshops and conversations. I'm seeing like, I'm calling out attention that people aren't even necessarily feeling themselves and pushing the needle, because I think it's in this space of tension and contradictions that if all of us can move into, and of course, there's a difference between being uncomfortable and being safe. So we can't just be creating conflicts that are making people unsafe, but uncomfortable, to a degree, we can stay in a place of discomfort for learning. And I think in design, that's also where, embodied practices and things like that can help take us. They can take us to, feeling of discomfort that allows us to become reflexive or to build awareness of social structures that we haven't been aware of in the past or that are in conflict with each other. And then by experiencing something, whether it's through dialogue or whether it's through being immersed in an immersive experience, we've been using kind of like theater and other things, or creating scenarios in patient rooms of the future, by engaging with these things and seeing the contrast and collision between different ways of knowing and being, it's helping people stay in that middle ground and have respectful negotiations, because we depend on each other to coexist. So we have to be able to move between. So I think that's what I'm increasingly interested in, is these like weird spaces of contradiction and mutual dependence that exist between those things.
One way that coordinated management of meaning has been broken down is to say, these kind of three main facets that are involved are coordination, coherence, and mystery. And so again, that coordination being about the relational piece, that you got to do it. You can't do any of it alone. It's all happening in relation. And so you have to coordinate. And so you have to be in dialogue. Like you're saying, you have to kind of reach out and engage in this like interplay of our stories and where they meet in that space. How are we coordinating? And coherence, again, not something that happens alone. You have to, that's how we're making meaning. Again, it's in the kind of our understanding is like what we're doing when we're telling stories is making meaning. Like the name of the podcast comes from a model within CMM, the loop model, which is L, bunch of U's, 2 T's. The L being lived stories, the T on the end being told stories. And then in between, there's all these other, the official ones are unknown stories, untold stories, untellable stories. But it's just trying to get at like, there's not one story. Again, there's not one story. There's not one truth. We live a story. And for example, you and I are living the story of this podcast right now, but the story we tell when we go away from this place will be different because we experienced it differently. We're coming at it with different contexts or expectations, different things that will, excite us about this, that will pull out, that will, kind of stick to going away from this conversation. And then mystery, which, we've kind of already talked about, that it's like, the improvisation is a word that we use. Like that's what it's about to me. CMM is like a toolbox of like, it's not what to do, but it's how to do what you do, or offering you a way to make meaning of what you do. Yeah. As you go on, that it's about the process and it's about the being together. And so we already kind of touched on, I said, we shape our social worlds, they shape us. But now that we're at this point in our conversation and really centering on dialogue, I'm curious about the role of reflexivity here for you in terms of, of maybe going back to the regeneration question, like what's the role of reflexivity? And I'd kind of love to move us in talking about, more explicitly this embodied design, how do we all participate in it? So that was me throwing a lot at you, but tell me about reflexivity in design.
Yeah. I think reflexivity has been such a core for me in what I'm studying and what I'm trying to practice, both myself and what I'm hoping to cultivate in others. So for me, reflexivity is really this awareness of the often taken for granted social worlds, social structures, the norms and rules that we are embedded in. So it's this kind of like turning back on itself, understanding these kinds of often invisible elements. And for me, that's so core. And it's different from the dominant design that's interested in kind of dictating how things are going to be reformed. Okay, so I find reflexivity actually to cultivate it supports plurality that we were discussing and the regeneration and the ongoing dialogue. And so it can cultivate the intentionality of others. So rather than pushing my own intentionality onto others, by nurturing the collective reflexivity, I think that's when we have a more of a chance for people to actually have the agency. And it needs to be collective. It's not just you are very reflexive, Abbie, and then in the institute, then great, you can. No, it actually requires this kind of relationality and reflexivity. So just to give an example, I'm working with a PhD student right now out in Fort Mohé, and he is working we're both working in Barum Commune in child welfare. And a lot of that work is to create a collective reflexive practice. And so we've done a number of embodied design interventions, like the use of a theater play that brings out lots of perspectives of how child welfare is working. We've also made physical prototypes like elastic that's stretching between different contradictions that service providers are using, and different kind of interventions to prompt reflection around things that people are often taking for granted in different pockets of the system. And Auden has led a process of creating a space for dialogue that happens every 2 weeks with the whole organization. And that's cultivating this ongoing reflexivity, because I think it's not enough so often. And I have earlier focused on these one-off moments of reflexivity where it's like, oh yeah, I've become aware of this eureka moment. And we, that's often celebrated in design. But I think if we want to create these regenerative systems, we actually need a sustained reflexive practice, sustaining dialogue around how do we reform based on that. So creating these kind of reflexive spaces that are held within our service systems that engage with many different perspectives, that have the plurality within them, that have some strangeness, but not too much, that, are carefully holding what's needed to keep this awareness of the taken for granted alive, because it can slowly also become turned into the machine. So it needs to be stewarded along the way. But I would say I'm very interested in creating these kinds of collective long-term pockets of reflexivity. And I would say, our parliaments are often spaces where this has been attempted. We're creating these reflexive zones, but often we can then get into the same old social structures and the binaries between parties and those things. I think as designers, we can contribute to designing sustained kind of reflexive spaces in service systems where people can come together, build this awareness regularly, reflect on their own ways of knowing and being, and together relationally negotiate how to shape the world otherwise. And so that for me is one of the most hopeful things about reflexivity, is having a collective reflexive practice that opens up for people together to kind of shape things in a multitude of different directions.
Yeah, you said nurturing collective reflexivity, and that is like, such a beautiful little nugget to pull out of this conversation, that it is a very hopeful kind of goal or like mission of like, this is the better social world we're working towards, is one in which we can nurture that collective reflexivity. I find that really beautiful, and it's taking me back to thinking about I think part of the new story that sounds to me like you're wanting to tell is challenging what is a system, and in terms of systems design. And I think about, it's important for me that when I talk about social worlds, people understand that is at many different levels. Like, our world is a social world. The country you live in is a social world. You've referenced, the different contexts, like living in different countries at different times, affecting your social world. That it's not the same. Our family structures, our communities, our interpersonal relationships, like that's all different manifestations of social worlds. It can be really intimate and small. And so I know, I'm hearing you say a similar thing of like, a system is not just a country's government or an organization's management, whatever. It's like our communities, our families, our interpersonal relationships, our systems in their own way too. So I want to hear more about everyday design. What do you want to offer people in terms of how they can be designing in their lives?
Yeah, thank you for that prompt. I'm particularly interested in moving away from this model of design being professional design, that we always just think, okay, design, that means something, a job that someone does, and that even designers see it, oh, that's something that I do at work in the kind of 9 to 5 context, because I think that creates a kind of disconnect where, again, we're creating these roles of designer, service provider, user, and we're just feeding into this siloed division and not allowing people to shape their worlds for themselves. So I think a big part of doing that is then owning that we are shapers in our everyday lives, including when we're, interacting with each other. So I think to bring that kind of really close to home, it's like currently in my Oslo community, I am in constant negotiation with friends and partners and things like this about our relations and our kind of structures of those. So, the norm is that we prioritize our romantic partner above all other relations in our life.
Yeah.
And this is something that's in constant dialogue and discussion among myself and my close community, is like, how can we reconfigure this? How can we depend on each other, including for things that we might feel that's like having somebody else do these things, would only happen that a partner would do or a parent would do for a child, or those things. So can we have other relations that are, physically taking care of us in certain ways, and prototyping those things in our everyday lives? And what does it mean to reconfigure our partnerships to also kind of create space for those different relations? And these navigating and shifting relational hierarchy and seeing, how we navigate relational multiplicity, these are things that in my everyday life is kind of very top of mind. And I think if we can be intentional about that with each other and talk about the dynamics that are showing up for us, including, there's some more discussions increasingly about folks who are, there's a kind of increasingly tendency for people to set boundaries and say, no, I don't have the energy to hang out, or to kind of cancel on plans and things like this. And it's like, let's talk about this tendency that we're experiencing in our community right now, that people are not having enough energy, or that are feeling like they can only show up when they're at their best, or whatever that is. So these kinds of discussions are reflexive discussions, are saying, okay, here are some of the patterns and structures that are shifting and shaping, or ones that have been imposed on us. Is that really the kind of relations we want to live out? Or can we configure our kind of ways of relating otherwise, that I have very different kind of notions of intimacy than we might think about in traditional relations, and that might be prioritized rather than kind of what has typically been the nuclear family, sexual intimacy kind of relations. So I think these are examples of the sort of everyday life design that I'm very interested in, and I think we can't stray away from if we are going to engage more equitably in everyone shaping the worlds that they're in.
Yeah, it's, to me, it's just like shouting from the rooftops, like, you get to design your life, you get to design your social world. Because again, I think we get stuck in the systems that are, and people, measure themselves against this kind of idea of should. How should it be? How should you relate to your romantic partner? How should you relate to your friends and your immediate family? And try to mold themselves into that, when I'm like, no. What works for you? Like, that's the better, whatever's your better social world, again, might not be the same truth as someone else. And so I just love what you're saying. I know I keep saying it's not about the outcome. And then I'm like, what are you making? So maybe the question is more like, how are you making, or how are you designing? But it's just like, that's maybe another little tangible thing I want to pluck from this conversation and offer people. That's a great question for reflexivity, not only to ask yourself, but to talk about in conversation with the people in your social worlds, of what are we making and what do we want to be making, and giving yourself the space and the ability to get connected to yourself and say, well, what feels good to me in a physical and emotional, relational, mental sense, all of it. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm taking away from what you're saying.
Yeah, I think one challenge to that, though, is actually that, that you're like shouting from the rooftops, like, you get to decide. And then it's like, except we're still within these kind of social worlds that are not just created by us and not just created by our close relations. So just to give an example of that, it's like I've explored polyamory and then felt what it feels like on my body, and then been like, okay, I get to decide. I want this other kind of way of relating. And then in my body, the socialization takes it takes its own form. And it's like, oh, I'm not sure at this moment in time I can sustain this idea of
Yeah.
kind of opening up to multiple partners, even though
Mhm.
intellectually, I absolutely agree. I should
Yes.
get to decide. We should all get to decide. But I'm still in this structure that pushes against that. And sometimes also in relation to gender, I don't correct people when they use my wrong pronouns because I feel like it's like such a force in society, you know? It's like, oh, I don't have the energy. It still happens to me. I don't actually get to decide that people use my pronouns.
Hmm.
So it is this kind of constant relational negotiation, both with those close in our lives. And they certainly like, it's
Yeah.
like, oh, my community certainly started using it. I can shift like, okay, this is what my relational constellation can look like to feel
Hmm.
better. So I do have agency, but there are indirect
Yeah.
relations that influence the extent of my own agency, how it feels on my body. And there's history of
Hmm.
other relations that I'm carrying with me that I don't get to decide. So I think it's like, again, back to that kind of messy middle. It's like, yes, we do have agency. And I think that's so exciting, but there's huge power dynamics
Yes.
and indirect influences that we're negotiating. And that's why I think the collective
Hmm.
relational
Hmm.
potential is so important, because together we can kind of like push up against those things and create pockets where possibility and like horizons of possibility are extended. But on our own or in isolation, there are many of these kinds of ongoing kind of impositions of dominance. So I think
Hmm.
it's really, a push and pull in that.
Yes. Yeah. A real like both and that's, that's not even representative enough. It's all, everything. And yeah, when I talk about wanting people to feel empowered and being able to create their social worlds, the kind of shadow side of that, which I appreciate that you're naming here, is like, what I don't want that to do to people is when something feels itchy or wrong in their social world, think that they've done something wrong because, well, they have control over it, but they don't. That's why
Mhm.
mystery has to be a
Mhm.
part of the conversation,
Mhm.
And so it is this, you get to design your worlds, asterisk, in relationship with others, in a system that is maybe working against you, in a world where you don't have agency over everything. And so it's kind of like, what's your sphere of influence, like
Mhm.
create and design where you can. I don't, that feels so like meh to like end on that note, but like, I think that's kind of where I'm at, because I want to appreciate that nuance of like, it is not all on your shoulders. And so I don't want it to feel like a pressure or a weight or a burden that then people are like, but I'm designing my social world, but it feels horrible right now. Like, there's real reasons for it to feel horrible and irritating and itchy in the ways that it does, So I don't know. I guess I'm going to keep reflecting on that.
Mhm. But I think for me, like that's where this notion of like extending our horizon of possibility
Yeah.
through pushing and
Yeah.
like this kind of more recent obsession with emergence. And it's like we don't have full control,
Yep.
but we can create the possibility of otherwise. And it will evolve and emerge and it's entangled in so many things, but together we can kind of extend our horizon. So I
Yeah.
don't think we have the ability to kind of steer or set our direction, but I think we can open up our horizons by shaping and
Yeah.
taking an active role in shaping those things.
Hmm. Yeah. I think that's well said. And I appreciate the nuance of that. Josina, as we wrap up, I wonder if there's a story that you would want to leave people with that kind of relates back to anything that we've talked about today. Any kind of story you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I guess just if I continue on some of the early discussions about gender and pronoun negotiation and things like that, if I reflect on, I had this kind of like moment after prototyping with friends in these different pockets and it feeling really good. Had this moment where I decided, okay, in my workplace context, I want to communicate to everyone my preferred pronouns. And so I created this kind of little comic trying to, again, use like design in my everyday life and
Yeah.
saying like,
Yeah.
okay, here's what it feels like for me. And I'm wandering around in this kind of wilderness. And this would be great if you relate to me in these ways. And then, sent it out to all of my colleagues. And then the next day at like a kind of large assembly and introduction to the students for the first time, I introduced myself with they, them pronouns. And I think over the course of that time, there's been others at school that have either come that use they, them pronouns, or that have kind of gender ambiguity or gender queerness that we're negotiating together. And people are using those pronouns and stumbling. And sometimes there's resistance and they're not. And I feel unseen. And I guess just to say, like, we're part of this larger transformation. And when we're acting on the itchiness that we feel or the horizon of possibilities we want to see, we together can create different spaces for each other that where we can kind of feel more alive, have more of these worlds that we want and need. And those are not always realized fully, and they're still in negotiation with others' truths and others' ways of being. But just a kind of a hopeful story to say that it's like, yeah, it's a struggle still. It's a ongoing tension, and yet like there's a possibility together with so many others in the space that I inhabit of, you know, living and relating otherwise that we're doing together. And that feels like hopeful and to me. And I think we can do those in many ways in our health systems and in the worlds that we're living in the other important systems that folks are inhabiting.
Yeah, something I'm taking away from our conversation is that we're in the messy middle, and that's kind of the point, is that it's kind of, we're always in a state of being and designing and communicating and creating together. So Josina, I really appreciate that story and everything you shared today. And what I want to leave people with is that language of better social worlds, and have them be thinking for themselves, reflecting on for themselves this conversation, the work that you're doing, the perspective you're bringing in terms of how it's creating better social worlds. So I won't actually have us explore that, but leave that for people to think about for themselves. This has been a really wonderful start of this conversation. There's so much more to think about and talk about and be in dialogue about together. So Josina, thank you so much for your time and your perspective.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Abbie.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.